Welcome everyone to a webinar about how to use
That's good.
Listenwise with English learners. With this move to remote and hybrid learning that we've all been experiencing the past year, we know that our English learners are not hearing nearly as much academic English, not being able to practice it as well. So given the disruptions to this kinds of instruction, we thought we'd provide this webinar for you to give you this resource that you can use with your English language learners, which we'll be diving deeply into over the next 45 minutes. So just to introduce who I am, I'm Monica Brady-Meyerhoff. I'm the founder and CEO of Listenwise, and I'm a former public radio reporter. And I've also lived overseas in Kenya and Brazil and speak many languages, which I've applied to some degree to my learning to how to teach, how to learn a language with listening. And I'm thrilled to welcome Rachel to join us. Why don't you introduce yourself, Rachel?
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Rachel Kramer Theodoro. I'm here in Massachusetts, but I've been a teacher in New York City and Massachusetts in K-12 education for a number of years. Now I am the elementary faculty leader at Brandeis University here in Waltham, Massachusetts. And we do teacher education as well as sheltered English immersion, SEI education for our teachers who will be teaching multilingual learners in public schools. Nice to see you all.
Yeah, and if you haven't done so already, tell us where you're from in the chat. So by the end of this webinar, we hope that you will learn more about the important role that listening plays in all learning, not just for ELs, but obviously for learning a language. And you're also going to see how podcasts that we have on Listenwise are great for equalizing learning and access and addressing some diversity and inclusion goals and SEL goals. A reminder that, again, all the stories and tools that we talk about today are found on Listenwise. Some of them are in free, many of them are in free, all the listening is free, and the rest are found in premium, which you can easily get a 30-day free trial of or a longer free trial for your school. And then we're going to really dig into some 3 key approaches to teaching ELs with podcasts. But first, I want to talk about how listening in general is foundational to learning. And we know this because listening comprehension and reading comprehension are tightly linked. So if your students build that strong foundation in listening, it will improve overall literacy skills, not just language acquisition skills. It's really good for all students. And many of you I saw in the chat are from K-12 classrooms in the US where you're going to have mixed populations. So you're not only teaching EL. So, but if you think about listening and how important it is in general for learning, and combining print and audio increases comprehension and recall overall. It's just an important skill to work on. And it's great for college and career readiness because no matter what your students go on to do, they're going to need to learn to be good listeners for a job or for college. But when you look closely at listening and reading, the research shows that better listeners are better readers. As students grow older, the relative importance of listening comprehension increases because it takes until the middle school years to reach the point where reading comprehension outpaces listening comprehension. And for our ELs, it could take even longer. So one study shows that as students got older, problems with reading comprehension emerge, and that provides a great opportunity for you to use audio instead of reading to close the content gap and to improve the background knowledge and expose students to vocabulary. That's why it's important to focus on student listening skills well beyond the years of direct reading instruction. The other thing it's important to note is that listening really is an equalizer for all students because all students are listening to the same thing. And they're all making their own meaning of it. But unlike reading, which you often scaffold down for the learner, Listenwise scaffolds up to the listening. And I'll show you some of those things and the ways that we do it. But it is a really easy way to get students to join into the conversation, understand a new topic, spark their interest in something. Also, it provides a really relevant text that have authentic voices from across the country and the world. So it can bring a lot of different viewpoints and people's voices into your classroom. Research also illustrates that instructional materials, assignments, and texts that reflect your students' backgrounds and experiences are really critical to engagement and deep, meaningful learning. And podcasts can help you do that because they represent a diversity of races, ethnicities, cultures, religions, classes, orientations. So providing this diverse multicultural content helps promote this idea of understanding diverse perspectives, mirrors to validate their own experiences, and then ways to foster empathy and social and emotional skills. I mean, actually, the research shows that even listening together builds empathy. Listening to somebody else's voice builds empathy. So great ways to do that through podcasting. And I'm going to go into part of the way that you build empathy is that you're visualizing something when you're listening. You're making a movie in your mind. And think about how powerful that can be for students who, if they were reading, might be tripping over a word and getting stuck on it. But they can listen to a story and just absorb that. And it can also give you this unique opportunity to put them in someone else's shoes. So I'm going to pop over to Listenwise right now and play a story that really illustrates this point. And it is a story about a traveling exhibit that helps people take the experience of a refugee and really go through some of what it's like to be a refugee. So I'm going to play this, and what I'd love you to do in the chat is just give me some of your reactions. How are you feeling? What does it sound like? And you're going to see some of the supports that we have for the listening as well as we listen to just about a minute and a half of this.
Here's an effort to make you know what it feels like to walk in the shoes of a refugee. More than 65 million people around the world have been forced to leave their homes. The UN says they're fleeing violence, persecution, disasters.
Can you hear it
Doctors
okay?
Without Borders hopes to show Americans what that life is like. They have a traveling exhibit they're taking to cities across the Northeast. NPR's Narit Eisenman joined the tour when it stopped in Washington, D.C.
Hi, guys. How are you?
Our guide is Dr. Ahmed Abdelrazek, who normally works in a refugee camp in Tunisia. And he tells our little group to imagine that war has just broken out. We're going to have to leave our homes, our town. Then he takes us to this wall hung with plastic cards listing our most essential possessions. And he makes a startling announcement.
So what will I ask you guys in 30 seconds? Pick only 5 items.
In other words, we have 30 seconds to go through the cards and pick just 5 things to take with us. Abdelrazek holds up a stopwatch.
Okay, in 30 seconds, go.
There's a mad scramble for the cards.
5 items only.
Rita Keetzer, she's a 55-year-old homemaker, drove 2 hours from Virginia just for this tour. She looks preoccupied. Is it hard?
Yeah, I have a lot of choices.
10 seconds.
I had to really look it over.
2, 1. Get off the time.
Abdelrazek inspects our picks.
What did you get here?
Cash, blankets, medicine. He notices no one brought shoes. Possible mistake. During the 1991 Persian Gulf War, when Abdelrazek was a kid, Saddam Hussein's government started bombing his town in southern Iraq. He and his family had to run.
So we walked and we walked. We walked for 10 days. 10 days non-stop. I remember I had flip-flop on my feet. On the 10th day, I had nothing on my feet.
No matter what you bring, he says, you're going to lose it fast, to pay off smugglers, or you'll get robbed. To illustrate this, Abdelrazek holds up a white box. Everyone has to throw in one of their 5 items.
I'll stop it there, and I'd love to see if you're chatting about what this makes you feel. Panic, stress, anxiety, uncomfortable. Those are all things that I was feeling listening to this. Gratitude, right, that you could even bring something, but then, you bring something and you're told, it's not the right thing. So it just gives a great example of how audio can place you into a moment outside of your classroom, outside of yourself, and make you experience something and feel something. And if you're working too with the English language learners, this is a mirror that might reflect their experience. They might not have been a refugee, but they might have had to leave a lot of things that they loved behind, or brought things that they didn't think that they thought they would need, but they didn't. So it's a good example of the kinds of stories that can really open up your students to learning language and language skills. And in the assignment resources, we give you more questions and things to ask about it. But thank you for sharing your thoughts on that too. I'm just going back to the chat to see. Yeah, fearful and anxious. All very, interesting things to try to bring into your classroom. All right, I'm going to turn now to looking a little more closely at the key approaches for using podcasts with ELs. And we've Rachel and I have worked together to break it down into 3 key practices. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Rachel, to talk about these at a high level, and then we'll go into each one in depth.
Sure thing. I always have so much to say about the content. So I put it in the chat this time. So many great historical thinking practices and so many things. But today we're going to focus on, we've boiled down a whole variety of practices into 3 key ones that we want to teach about today. So building background knowledge and accessing prior knowledge, they really are 2 separate things, but they do the same thing in the brain. And so we want to both fill in the gaps that are back there. And we also want to access, as Monica mentioned, perhaps people have background knowledge on the topic, right? Perhaps there's background knowledge from prior teaching, but then there's also, especially in the humanities and science and everywhere, we have to fill in that background. The second key practice is around identifying the language for the content. And I put a link here to the World-Class Instructional Design and Assessment, otherwise known as WIDA, which is an international set of standards for English language development. That's what ELD stands for. And they've identified from a systemic functional approach that we need to be focusing on what is the language our students need for success in the content. So this means what are they going to need to understand and be able to do in listening and speaking with some of these podcasts. If there are reading and writing skills and language that they need, what are these things? And it's beyond just vocabulary. Really, it's looking at cross-disciplinary language, looking at phrasing, looking at the length of our discourse and the way that we're explaining and understanding each other. And lastly, we're going to look at a set of scaffolds. And Listenwise has really helped its constituents here think about scaffolding before, during, and after listening. And we'll show you a few examples of each. All right, so we're going to start with building background today. And so you might use scaffold, one of the stories, and this one we have here is Elie Wiesel's Night, and it's a particular podcast related to the Holocaust, using a KWL chart. Just put a check mark or something in the chat. How many of you have used the KWL charts before? I like to sometimes think about KW Howl, H-O-W-L, and I put an H in between there to help my students think about how will I learn what I want to know. And so you can be able to access background knowledge with what students know, but begin to get to know what kids want to know, and the adults too that you work with, using the KWL or the KW Howl. And it begins to access some prior knowledge. Another way of using this, and I'll show, I actually don't know, I'm not doing the presenter, but if you imagine the y-axis point on the screen here, you can categorize each one of these rows. So for example, if we're talking about the Holocaust, one row can be about who is involved. Another row can be about where in the world did this happen. Another row could be accessing background knowledge and building background knowledge on when and what time of history. Why, you can go through the problems and the resolutions. You can create a category for each one of the rows so that students can resurrect the knowledge that they've been thinking about in particular. And there are many other ways to use a KWL in building background knowledge, but these categories really help English learners because they have to sift through a lot of language, right? To figure out what do I want to say and how does this make sense to where I want to head going next.
And you know, I'm going to pop in here. Oops, whoops, did not want to do that. I want to take you back to the website and show you this, this actual story, because that has some of the ways you can build background knowledge with ELs as well. So when there's this little scaffold signal on the page, this little icon means we've done more of the work for you. Mm-hmm. So you're going to want to go to the scaffolding tab and look at the building background knowledge. And this walks you through it. Students should have some knowledge about the Holocaust. And then down here, if your students are at a lower level of English language proficiency, maybe use this resource with them is a good place to start. Remember the Children, Daniel's story. If your students have more advanced language skill, the Holocaust Museum's Learn About the Holocaust page is a rich resource. And those are all also provided over here with the external resources. So we're trying to make it easy. I know it's hard to have so many levels to teach and so many pieces of content to teach and to try to figure out what to give each student at each level. So when I say that like Listenwise has scaffolding that helps bring the listener to the audio and be able to understand it, that's what I mean by that. So let me go back
Absolutely.
to this.
And I would just add one other point, which is that do plan on curating, curate a group of resources that can do this building of background knowledge. And you have a great start with the tools that are already existing on the site. All right.
So the other way to build background knowledge is building vocabulary background knowledge, like really being specific and deliberate about the vocabulary that you build. And we help with that by pulling out tier 1, 2, and 3 vocabulary words in every story. Actually, the stories with that little green scaffold, stair step, have tier 3, the others have tier 2. But what's exciting about this is that in an audio story, you really get to stretch your students' receptive vocabularies. And there aren't a lot of ways to do this with, if you're just speaking informally or you're trying to use a lot of words, you can't possibly pack in as many as there are in a short story from NPR or a podcast. So for example, I'm going to use this story about, we call them weird news. And it's because they're 30 seconds long and they often are very kind of funny, interesting stories, but they pack a punch when it comes to vocabulary. And we pull out the 2 most relevant vocabulary words here. But if you noticed on the slide, I had even more vocabulary words listed. So I'm going to read you all the vocabulary words. Then let's listen to this 30-second story. Familiar, traveled, resident, recently, lounging, reunited, and current. This is all in 30 seconds. Here we go.
Good morning, I'm Rachel Martin. Sometimes all you want is a familiar front porch. Maybe that's what was going through the mind of a yellow lab named Cleo when she traveled 60 miles to her family's old house in Lawson, Missouri. They moved out in 2018. The new residents recently came home to find Cleo lounging on the porch. She's since been reunited with her family at their current address. No one knows how she traveled those 60 miles, but it must be a really great front porch.
So a great fun story that is going to engage your students. And then you could go to the listening comprehension questions and theme questions that we've created for you to find some of those vocabulary words, or you could just go back and just do a deep dive on these words as well. But prepping them, getting them ready to hear them is such a key part of building more of that background knowledge for your students. So let me go back to this and turn it back over to Rachel to talk a little bit more about this concept of language and content together.
Yeah, and if you notice, just those extra words that Monica carefully thought about were ones that would further and deepen the understanding, and those go beyond perhaps the technical language of that cute, very cute story. So I'll just give you a minute to read these 2 quotes on the slide. Multilingual learners develop content and language concurrently, right? With academic context. And this idea of considering language as dynamic and not static, right? And our colleague, Jeffrey Weirs from Stanford, who's written several books, one of which is listed here in the slide, is reminding us that learning language goes beyond just vocabulary, right? And even beyond just for the sake of academics, right? He even goes further to say that there's a danger of over-focusing on individual words when this happens, it kind of sets children away and students away from really going into the concepts and deepening their conceptual understanding of what's going on. So we want to be thinking beyond that. We want to be thinking about what's the phrasing that's happening here. In that last story, I think a lot about sort of the joy and the humor that's involved. So there's a tone to a story. So we want to be teaching kids that there's language, not just vocabulary, but there's tone and phrasing and expressions. There's a lot of work in the English language education around idioms, right? And sayings, and how use of that language really shows a familiarity with the topic. And we want to teach kids and our students of all ages exactly what this is. So we want to also be thinking about a genre. So not just genre as in realistic fiction or historical fiction, but to be thinking about how to teach kids to argue and debate. And there's language for that. There's LY words, right? There are transition words. There are superlatives that we use when we're trying to argue or debate our ideas. And that's part of the language that's needed to express in the content. The other point that he's making here about language being dynamic is that if you notice, even in a news story, right, the story evolves through what the speaker is saying and how the listeners are interpreting it. And that happens in interviews, right, on these news stories. The same thing happens in a classroom. When you're beginning to share your ideas, they come together in your mind, and you might pull some strong vocabulary from your background knowledge, or you may piece it together with lower level, more tier 1 vocabulary, tier 2 vocabulary. So language will develop as students continue to use it. But you need to spend some time as teachers to really thinking about what I call the water in which you swim. So I teach my college students to think about the fish doesn't recognize the water in which it swims. So when we're speaking, we're not always recognizing the tiered vocabulary, the colloquialisms we might be using, the phrasing. We might even break off our sentences and use incomplete sentences when we're speaking and sharing, and even when we're reading texts. And so we need to spend a lot of time analyzing not just vocabulary, but what's our phrasing like, and what's the length and the complexity of the language that we're teaching. And we do that by preparing ourselves to not only understand it, but then to move into scaffolding, which is where we're heading next. All right.
Yeah, so, you talking about idioms is such a great example of how there are many idioms related to topics that you're teaching, or certain words that are tier 3 that are specific to subject matter that it's important to teach. So, for example, this story about the development of the Homeland Security Department involves a lot of language that may not be familiar, but is very important to understanding not just Homeland Security, but government operations. So pre-teaching and activating prior knowledge will help here, especially around the vocabulary and phrases from the story that may help with the context, including different forms of the words like resilience and resiliency. Also, words like bureaucracy may be more readily understood in this context as a government organization or group. And then this story also comes with a lot of idioms. And boy, until you've learned another language yourself, like, you really don't know how important those are to understand, and how difficult they can be, because they can be so strange. And so that's kind of the actually, I'm going to go over and play a little bit of it, because what I love about this story, in it, the way it can show you as an example, is that within like a minute, you've got a couple of different idioms that you could spend an entire class period on just these idioms. So the story again is about sort of how the Homeland Security Department came about following 9/11. It does have the scaffolding for ELs. And I'm going to jump into the first minute of the transcript so we can just hear the idioms. And mostly they're spoken by Janet Napolitano, the former, she was current Homeland Security Secretary at that time. So here we go.
One of the first.
In its early days, the Department of Homeland Security was something of a makeshift affair. The first secretary, Tom Ridge, operated out of a double cubicle, a bit more modest workspace than most of his fellow cabinet officers. The different agencies' computers couldn't talk to one another, and there were the inevitable turf wars. Current Homeland Security Secretary Janet Napolitano gives her predecessors, Ridge and Michael Chertoff, a lot of credit for getting the thing going.
I think that Secretary Ridge and Chertoff did yeoman's work in getting the department up off its feet. It's the kind of department that it's kind of, you have to build the plane while you fly it. And I think that it has really begun to gel in important ways.
Listen to how many things there are in there. Up off its feet, gel in certain ways, a lot of credit. I mean, and you're learning about 9/11 security. It's a very good social studies topic. So again, listening to it versus reading it or trying to explain out of context what some of these idioms mean can be very, very powerful. Okay, I'm going to head back to the presentation and pass it back to you, Rachel.
Putting in the chat, just a reminder, there is so much water in which we swim in, and that piece alone, there's so much conveyed with just all of those different colloquialisms and sayings. And we have to pre-assess that as teachers of language, as we all are. And I'd like to call my teachers, you are teaching all language learners ALL, and everybody's learning language. So prepare yourself. And we can do that through scaffolding. So we were talking, Monica and I planning, we're thinking, gosh, what happens with scaffolding? Well, really what it is that teachers are choosing from a menu of options. And I know many of you mentioned that you know the KW. And we have to be thinking about not just having students take in the information, but also thinking about how are we supporting each and every step of the way, that before, during, and after listening. And I always ask my students to be thinking about what are some of those low prep, easy, quick scaffolds that you can throw into any lesson anytime. And then also pre-plan and really think through some of the higher prep ones. So the KWL might be a little higher prep to some extent. Or you may do another thing like a turn and talk, or you know, just a quick think, jot, and write. Think and write in their journals as another form of scaffolding. So why don't we go to the next slide? And so a couple of ideas that we wanted to share with you today is the idea of pre-teaching vocabulary through an inventory. And what essentially that is, and there are many different varieties of vocabulary inventories. You can note in the chat again if you've ever done a vocabulary inventory. But I like to think about empowering English learners' first languages as well, and to use art to help students recall what it is they may know already about vocabulary. And another hot tip about vocabulary, go beyond the single word. Think about phrases, right? Turf wars, right? Some of those phrases can be part of your vocabulary. So you can take just a sheet of paper and create a table, and the categories can be, have I heard it? Have I seen it? Have I used it? What is it in my first language? Can I draw a picture of it? And you can also create a column with its definition or its use in context. And kids can keep track of where, what vocabulary they have heard, seen, used, and perhaps then how it is used. And that's what a vocabulary inventory does. And it's a great way to pre-teach early in the listening experience. I also remind my students to have students keep that vocabulary tool as they go through units, so they can refer back to it. With activating prior knowledge, we talked about that categorized KWL. So that's something you can go back to. Really do think about all the different categories of the background knowledge that you want students to be looking at, and use the resources that Listenwise has curated as well as some of your own. And next, we're going to take a look at the anticipation guide to introduce a story. So what I really like about this one is that, and again, pop in the chat if you've heard of or used an anticipation guide. By the way, if you Google that, you'll get a ton of PDFs out there and videos to show you just what it is all about. But remember, we're both going to activate prior knowledge and we're going to build background knowledge. Those are two separate things. Activating is thinking about what I already know, and building is filling in the gaps. So this anticipation guide, and the way you use it is before listening, you can create a statement or a set of statements that you want students to key into regarding any one of the stories that you're going to be listening to. And you can put these statements on the board or in your slideshow or however you're doing it. And students can just simply mark true or false, or they can have an I agree, a disagree, or they can have any other form of response that you decide, usually an either or kind of response. And students will write down their thinking. Then you go through the listening, right? You have the story, maybe you do a few other activities. And afterwards, you can have students, and this would happen. So this tool you actually use before and after listening, but later in your lesson, you can have students go back and re-examine and say, gosh, you know, before we started this whole thing, this is what my thinking was. Now I'm at a new point. And that's a really powerful way to help kids constantly stay active and connected to what they're listening to. And so it really gives you a chance with an anticipation guide to both activate some prior knowledge, to you can use some of these Listenwise stories to build background knowledge. I'm thinking of that first one we listened to about refugees, especially if you're doing a unit on immigration. I was just reading one of my students' lessons, unit plans, a 4th grade unit plan on immigration, and he did a whole piece on refugees. And so he might use parts of that story to activate and build background knowledge, and then move into some of the other lessons. So that's some of the great things that we can do to help build buy-in, but also to really help students access some of the things that they already know to keep them engaged in the lesson.
So I'll talk a little bit about some of the features on Listenwise that can help you select the right audio before listening, because that's important, knowing the right level of audio for your students. And it's exciting that now Metametrics, the makers of the Lexile text level, have created an audio measure. And Listenwise is the only company that has it at the moment. And what it does is it allows you to know the difficulty of an audio passage and thus make the right choice for each student. And it's on a Lexile scale similar to the scale that's used for reading, but it's not exactly the same as reading. So just if your students are 900 900R in reading, they're not necessarily going to be 900L. In fact, they'd most likely be 1010L or 1200, because listening comes easier than reading at all ages. Up until at least the middle school years, you can listen as much as 2 to 3 grade levels higher than you can read. And for English learners, this is absolutely true as well. So what they're doing with this scale is measuring the audio passage on 16 different factors: vocabulary, syntax, sentence structure, as well as pace and pausing in the audio. So and what's great about Listenwise too is students can also have access to that and make their own choices. So you could have them experiment around with the different levels of audio measure to determine where they think a good fit is. And then how could they stretch themselves on some of their listening? So if we look at what do you do during listening, this is where we get to some metacognitive strategies around improving your listening skills. Rachel's going to talk a little bit about note taking in a minute, but really there's a lot that can be done just before you even start with some simple practice. You can improve your students' listening skills, or they should know they can improve their skills. Just because we all are hearing adults or children doesn't mean we're good listeners, and just listening more doesn't help. So what you want to do is apply some of these strategies in your classroom. First, direct their attention. Share with students that this is a task that they're going to do together, and that their mind may wander, but they need to direct their attention back to the task. They could use some note-taking strategies. And if they hear something they don't understand, they can adjust based on what they hear to correct their own misunderstanding. So then you want to move to planning. You need to set a goal for the listening. So this is not telling your students how to listen, but telling them what ideas, details, or words that they should be listening for. Our planning and goal-directed listening that we just did on the 9/11 story was for the idioms. So it's that simple, like drawing their attention to it and making them plan. And by activating some prior knowledge about what is an idiom, how should you listen for it, that it's typically several words, things like that will help them. And then problem solving. So students will not know every word and concept they hear. They will need to problem solve, and letting them know that's okay, that they're problem solving listeners. They can make guesses, and tell them to use the overall idea of the story to help understand the words and phrases that they don't understand. So the other element of good, during listening activities is what I already showed you, this interactive transcript. Print and audio in real time really helps students develop their language skills. Incidental exposure to vocabulary through listening to stories helps them know the meaning of unknown words, and they can see how the words are spelled and authentically pronounced. And listening while reading also helps them recognize letters and new words. And then the other element I didn't show you, but this button up here at the right of every single story allows you to slow down the audio by 20%. It doesn't corrupt the same authentic sound of the audio, but boy, is it really a lifesaver, especially for English learners.
Absolutely.
You want to talk? Yeah, I want you to talk a little bit about these organizers and note takers. Some of these are from Listenwise, but there are lots of note taking strategies you can employ for better listening.
This is the year that I feel like, with all the pandemic learning online, and I suspect that many of you were online teaching this year too, there has been a lot of guided note taking. So I don't know if any of you want to pop in the chat if you are a guided note taking fan out there. And I don't know about any of you, but I remember when I was taught to teach, to take notes, it was this whole like Roman numeral 1, 2, and 3 business.
A, B, C,
yeah. Right, yeah. And no one ever said, well, what is the language structure of a bullet, right? And this is something that young kids, older kids, my college students, adults, we don't always know exactly what it is we need to write down. So what you see here are a couple of ways to start capturing the notes. And as a language teacher here, I want to help you think about some other things. So really think about what we're taking notes on. The organizer on the left, if you look at that listening organizer, where it says the fact, question, teacher. Very, very simple. What's a fact? What's a question? And you can really model, because sometimes students are saying facts that they turn into questions, or asking questions that they can turn into facts. And it's a way to really stop and pause and think about what's the purpose of each of these and what's the formulation of these. And you can teach them how to ask questions about content, and how to cull from the listening, using those transcripts, using other tools, some facts that you want to say. And really do spend some time teaching phrasal writing. Are you writing like, Helen Keller was a teacher, right? Or Helen Keller, had the specific disability, and maybe you're just writing the disability, right? And what a bullet is. And so the organizer on the right, I also love as a language teacher, because if you look at each of these items that are checkboxed here, Helen Keller was born on June 27th. Her mother noticed she couldn't see or hear, and first taught. So you have who is involved, you have when something's happening, you have what is going on. You have so many different pieces. And what Listenwise does so nicely is it breaks down all the pieces of a story into the W questions, right, of a story. And it will help students also hone in on particular words like communicate and sign language, and some of the other key cross-disciplinary language like represent, communicate, and so many other key language that students will need to know in order to comprehend this full text. So what's really nice is that you can pick and choose from the variety of organizers that are on Listenwise, and you can structure some of your own organizers built off of these frameworks as well to complement your learning.
The stories on Listenwise are pulled directly from public radio and podcasts, so they are authentic and real, but that also means they're pretty high level. So we say they're intermediate to advanced language learners, maybe a high beginner, but what's really impressed me is seeing some WIDA level 2 teachers teachers with WIDA level 2 students using these organizers to just help them hear the language. So they would use the listening organizer, a language identification organizer, to just knowing that it's above their level, but just they can hear a word or phrase and check it if they hear it. So lots of different ways you can apply this in your classroom with your students. So let's talk about after the listening now. So one easy way to determine how students did they understand what they heard, is a quiz. So Listenwise has multiple choice auto-scored listening quizzes on hundreds of stories. You could select one for your students. They could select one for themselves on a topic that they're interested in, but they're assessing them on 8 key skills of listening, and primarily always the main 4: main idea, literal meaning, a vocabulary word in context, and making an inference. This is an example of a quiz item that assesses the skill of identifying the main idea. So students can, this aligns to Common Core standards, this aligns to many standards all over the country, whether you're using Common Core or not. But what's exciting about it is that students can be encouraged to practice their listening multiple times with quizzes, and maybe you're not even grading them or keeping track of them, but you're seeing just if they got the main idea, like did they get the gist of it? Maybe they didn't understand every vocabulary word. And on Listenwise, when the student sees it, a toolbar pops up, and the toolbar helps them by being able to read words out loud that are not part of the audio story. They can also, if not in the quiz function, the general listening function, they can get definitions in English, in Spanish, and a picture dictionary. But the idea is to give you a really simple way to encourage their listening and just know that they did it. A newer feature too in Listenwise is the tracking of the time spent on the task. So now you can look at a student who is given a quiz. This story is 4 minutes and 33 seconds, and then you take the quiz. So let's say if you knew every answer to the question right away, it'd take you 5 minutes, 5.5 minutes. But there are students who might turn it in after 3 minutes and you know they haven't done the listening. So just some new ways for you to be able to track it. And this is a way that you would track those main skills I was talking about, literal, main idea, vocabulary, and you can click in and actually see what the correct answer was and have a discussion with your students around why they chose the answer they did versus the answer that's correct. Another great way is through speaking practice. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Rachel, to talk a little bit about this to begin with.
Sure. So we go back to our friend Jeff Swears, and I'll put his information and some other points in the chat soon. And a lot of his research is focused on academic conversation in schools and between students about a topic. And so, after you've spent all this time getting ready for this great story that you're going to listen to, and then you're deep in it and you're deep in the details as you listen, and you've got your great notes and you've begun to practice both listening to and using some of the phrasing and language, you're ready for a conversation. And you can do conversation. Again, WIDA has this great framework about a functional framework for language, is really thinking about academic conversations to either argue points, to maybe narrate back and forth, to retell a story, to inform, maybe to prepare a summary or a project or a presentation around what you've learned, or maybe even to explain something. So explaining, what is this thing about choosing what you need to take if you were a refugee, explaining why that's happening. And so you as a teacher can decide which language function and which genre you want to focus on. And you can teach students both the soft skills, that's how to ask questions, how to throw the proverbial ball back and forth in a conversation, but you can also teach them ways to elaborate. And what I love about Zweer's work is that he teaches you how to use hand signals to help encourage conversations. So sometimes you want to build on a partner's point. Sometimes you want to tell some key reasons to argue your point. Sometimes you want to weigh or consider an opinion versus another opinion, and a whole host of other things. So he has a couple of several great texts, but two in particular that I'll put in the chat before we leave. One is focused on K-3 students. I would say every person in every age group should read that book. And then there's one focused on 6 through 12 in the content areas. So there's a number of great things that you can do beyond the listening with some really careful teaching. And I'll just say one other thing. I worked with a middle school teacher doing this, comparing and contrasting some things about ancient China. And she decided, oh, this sounds like a really complicated thing for my first WIDA 1 and 2 level students to do. But we decided to lower the cognitive level. So we decided to have an academic conversation about which is better, chatting in the chat or unmuting in a Zoom meeting to participate. And students learn to build on each other's points and weigh out each other's points through a lower cognitive demand topic before they raised it back up and talked about ancient China. So you really can use this tool in a couple of ways to really get at the so what after listening. All right.
Rachel, I was just going to play a good example of this from a teacher. You've already talked about this turn and talk, this layering. This is an ELD teacher in Tahoe, Truckee, California. And this is a short clip where she explains how she does it with her students. So let's listen to that.
A lot of the strategies that Jeff Swears covers in his book are kind of my go-to handbook as far as conversations, and then we've been doing little breakouts. One strategy that I love just for like a pre-writing strategy, or even for a summary, like even after listening to a Listenwise story, is stronger and clearer. So they speak with one partner, and they maybe they write it in the chat for an older group, but for the younger groups, I just have them say their idea first, and then they go out into a breakout room and speak with one partner, and they build on their idea a little bit more and get it a little bit stronger, and then they do another breakout room and go with a different partner and try and strengthen their idea a little bit more, and then they come back to the whole group, and hopefully they have a stronger idea of whatever they're maybe their small writing piece is going to be, or their hypothesis for, for watching a science video, or their prediction of what's going to happen next, or if they're summarizing, they just have a stronger and clearer idea, and they get the chance.
Yeah, so I'm cutting her a little short because I think you illustrated that as well, Rachel.
A lot of the strategies
sorry.
that
every time I touch it, it goes again. Okay. Yeah, Rachel, you did a great job illustrating that as well as a great way to build on speaking practice. Yeah, listening and speaking, they go together. So it's great to always think about what's the speaking practice you're doing coming out of the listening.
Absolutely.
Great. Well, we're almost out of time, so I just want to close with a few ideas about how to use the Listenwise resources. We're going to share this this entire presentation with you via email, so you'll be able to click on all these things and see the choice boards and the instructional strategies toolkit and some more resources for Google Classroom, so that you can take your time exploring them all. But I think you've probably learned today there are just many ways to use listening as a strategy for content acquisition, for vocabulary, for building background, for just language fluency. We didn't even get into pronunciation and language fluency, but there's so many different ways. So I want to encourage you all, if you haven't done so already, sign up for a free school trial or a free teacher trial at listenwise.com. Watch our other webinars. Rachel, any last parting words?
No, I just say, Listenwise, when I saw this product, I just said English learners are only to benefit. So I would highly, highly recommend play around with the trial, try it yourself, try it with your students, a few that you've left before they run away for the summer, and have fun.
Have fun. That's what it's all about. And happy listening, everyone. Thanks for joining us today.